And so here's an American writer, Susan Griffin, who says the following: all that lives, that surrounds us, are in us. And from the medical point of view, that's been called, in 1977, by an American psychiatrist and physician, George Engel, a biopsychosocial view. A biopsychosocial simply means that the biology of human beings cannot be separated from their psychology and from their social relationships. Now, this is not a new insight. In 1938, there was a Hungarian-born physician at Harvard University from Transylvania, he's Hungarian from Transylvania, who was a lecturer at Harvard, a very renowned one. To this day, they have a memorial day in his honor, a research day in his honor at Harvard University. His name was Soma Weiss. And Weiss was a pharmacologist and a student and a physician interested in physiology. But he gave a lecture in 1938 to a medical school class where he said that emotional and psychological factors are as important in the causation of illness as physical factors, and they must be at least as important in treatment. So 3 years ago, there was a study that showed that women with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder had doubled the risk of ovarian cancer. Multiple studies have shown, for example, that children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to develop asthma. If you look at how we treat asthma, which is an inflammation of the airways and a narrowing of the airways, we treat them with adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline opens up the airways and cortisol reduces the inflammation. Now, what are adrenaline and cortisol? As many of you know, they're stress hormones. And you'd think we would ask ourselves, gosh, we're treating everything with stress hormones. Is it possible that stress may just possibly have something to do with the onset of this illness? It's an obvious question. Most people never ask it. That's an ideological blind spot, because it seems like such an obvious inquiry to make. So, going back to my own experience as a family physician, I began to notice that who got sick and who didn't wasn't actually accidental. And as a family doctor, I had a certain advantage over my specialist colleagues in that I knew the people before they got sick. And not only did I know them individually, I also knew them in the context of their families and the context of their multi-generational family histories as I got to know people over time. And so what I found, that illness wasn't simply accidental, that these conditions maybe were not so idiopathic after all. They were idiopathic in the sense that we don't know what causes them only if we look only at the biology. But if we looked at people's actual lives in the context of their experience since childhood and in the context of multi-generational family history, all of a sudden what looked like a mystery wasn't such a dilemma to figure out after all. And I noticed that there were certain characteristics of people who got chronically ill. So this trait of automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a prime characteristic of the disease-prone personality, number one. So there's an expression in English, I don't know whether it translates into German, but it says the good die young. The good die young. And often they do, for a reason. Not because it's bad to be good, but because the people they consider good are often good to everybody else but themselves. And that's what the problem is. The problem is not in being good. The problem is a selective goodness that excludes the self. So this automatic identification with duty, role, and responsibility is the second trait of what I call the disease-prone personality. When I say identification, I mean, it's from the Latin idem, which means the same, and facere, to make. So identification means I make myself the same as something. So I can tell you, as a workaholic physician, I was totally identified with my work. And that's not the same as enjoying my work. It's not even the same as being dedicated to my work. It means that I didn't know who I was apart from my work. So that's what I'm talking about, this rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility. And that could be applied to any role: wife, husband, partner, employee, employer, artist. So that's the second characteristic, healthy anger. There's such a thing as healthy anger. There's also such a thing as unhealthy anger. But in our brain, we have a circuit for rage. Not just we do, all mammals do, for good reason. I can talk about that later. When that's suppressed, repressed, so that you're just nice and smiling all the time, you're in trouble. Because the repression of anger, for reasons I'll explain to you, actually suppresses the immune system, or it turns it against you. And that's not voodoo or insight, it's science. So that's the third characteristic. I mean, fatal beliefs. One is that he's responsible for how other people feel, and the other is that he would never disappoint anybody. So those then are the four characteristics of what I recognized as the disease-prone personality. What I didn't realize is that other people, researchers, have realized the same things and have published papers about them. Because nobody in medical school ever tells you. That I realized that all these other people that researched this and described this. But again, it's like knowledge that doesn't enter you into your field of vision if you're trained as a physician. Now, before I go on, the question that comes up is, well, are you blaming people for getting sick? Are you saying it's their fault? Well, no, we're not saying that. Not at all. Because these patterns are not conscious. They're not deliberate. They're not chosen by anybody purposefully. They are childhood adaptations.